Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, Protect Your Legacy, Agricultural Land Conservation Easements. I'm Emma Olmos, Alachua Conservation Trust Conservation Events Coordinator. I'm joined by Erica Hernandez, our Conservation Director, Justice Diamond, our Agricultural Conservation Specialist, and our speakers tonight, Joel Love, who is a part of UF-IFAS and the Swanny River Partnership Steering Committee, as well as David Royal of the Nature Conservancy. Tonight's presentation is a part of ACT's Keep Florida Wild virtual series. If you would like to support future environmental education programming like tonight's talk, a donation can be made through texting Florida Wild to 44321, and we'd appreciate your support. A recording of tonight's talk will be available online following the event on ACT's YouTube channel. There will also be a Q&A following tonight's presentation this evening, and you can submit your questions throughout the talk in the chat or in the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. The webinar tonight aims to connect landowners with tools and cost share programs aimed at protecting the Florida aquifer, springs, and rivers it feeds. And here are some more background on tonight's speakers. Erica Hernandez joined ACT in the spring of 2019 and has spent her career researching flora and fauna across the state of Florida. She earned her master's in interdisciplinary ecology at the University of Florida. Erica loves to be neck deep in mud or crawling around salt palmettos looking at Florida's rich ecological heritage. Before joining ACT, Erica was a public servant for state agencies and public universities for over 20 years, often collaborating on complex projects requiring large stakeholder participation. Justice Diamond was born and raised in Tallahassee, Florida. Justice attended the University of Florida, where he earned a bachelor's in science in agricultural operations management with a concentration in sustainable crop production. Justice received his master's degree in agricultural and biological engineering in the spring of 2019, where he focused on improving irrigation scheduling methods through the use of smartphone applications for evapotranspiration-based irrigation scheduling of field corn. In his free time, Justice enjoys biking, paddling, and camping. David Royal is the Florida Nutrient Stewardship Project Manager for the Nature Conservancy. He works with farmers throughout Florida to implement the 4R philosophy to nutrient stewardship, a science-based approach to applying the right fertilizer at the right rate, at the right time, and in the right place. Joel Love has extensive experience working with farmers in the Swanny Valley to implement best management practices to reduce nutrient loading, conserve water, and improve soil health. Joel is both the UF-IFAS Best Management Practice Outreach Coordinator and a member of the Swanny River Partnership Steering Committee. Joel works closely with farmers through on-farm demonstrations to show the benefits of implementing agricultural best management practices. So now I'm going to hand it off to David, who is going to start our presentations for the evening. And while David is pulling up his presentation, I'd just like to remind everybody that you are welcome to put in your questions in the chat or the QA box at any time during the presentation, and we will get to them at the end.
Uh-oh. What are y'all seeing?
It's loading, I think. If you hit from beginning again, I think we should get it up. Yeah, I'd click that, see what happens.
Is that it?
Yes, we've got it. All right.
Good evening, everybody, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit. I've been with the Nature Conservancy for 8 years, and my whole role is I work with farmers across the state of Florida on their nutrient programs, and we're seeing great responses to the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program. But before we start, I'd like to, this is a little slide I like to start off with that I got from another individual, but I think that a lot of people don't understand agriculture and what the farmer goes through to be able to grow the crops so that we can eat each and every day. This is a picture of my parents' place. They have a place on the Chassawiscus, so we know how important the springs are. And I think everybody that's here in Florida does want to protect the water quality the best they can. and do everything that they can to do it. But who's really to blame for the water quality? I think there is a lot of issues that we need to look at real quick before we get into what the farmers are doing. This is a chart that I had the university do several years ago for me. And the green line is agricultural acres and the orange line is population growth. And I think we know here in Florida that that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem, especially with the people that are moving in. This is a breakdown of ag land in Florida. This is the last report that they have. And in my work, mainly what I'm working with is row crop farmers. And we see that there's 442,000 plus acres of row crops in Florida. So many people don't understand that Florida is the vegetable winter basket for the whole eastern United States. And then the other thing that is different about Florida is a lot of our land can grow as much as 4 different crops on the same acre throughout the year. Whereas if you go in the Midwest, they grow 1 crop and they're finished. So that makes a big difference in our farming practices and what we do. One of the biggest problems we have is there's 21 million plus people in Florida. And over the last 10 years, there's been 900 people a day moving into our state on an average. And one thing I like to share with people, and this is so important, I live in South Central Florida, but this is a little area in Manatee County, a little town called Parrish. And 15 years ago, this is what it looked like, and what it mainly was farmland, row crop farms, and citrus. And today, this is how it looks. A little town of Parrish has over 35,000 homes being permitted on the books as we speak, and there's already thousands and thousands of homes already built. Several of the farmers that I work with in that area, they've leased land, and there's roughly about 6,000 acres that they've lost to development over the last couple of years. And the thing is once this land becomes development, it can never be green space again. And that's one thing we need to keep in the back of our minds as we continue to have land in Florida being developed. Department of Environmental Protection has the B maps, and I know most of y'all have heard of them. They're growing as in our area, and one of the areas that I like to use as an example is the Swanny B map, which is in this area, and it's going to require a 4 million pound reduction of nitrogen. And the way the land is broke out, agriculture is going to be responsible for 80% of that reduction. This is a kind of a broke out diagram of how the Swanny B map is broken in. And every B map is broken in different percentages. So you've just got to look at those and see how they are. This is a picture of the B maps across Florida right now. And as I said before, this area is going to continue to grow as DEP keeps implementing more and more areas of B maps, because it's basically going to be where the waterways are to help try to come up with ways to protect the water. The other issue that agriculture is facing is this last year, Senate Bill 712 was passed in the House and in the Senate. And the crutch of it is farmers are now going to have to provide their nitrogen and their phosphorus use on a farm every year to the Florida Department of to FDACs. So this is something new, even though the farmers are required to keep records. This is just a way that they can put the usage together in each watershed. One of the things I like for people to understand too is across Florida, how big some of the watersheds are. The Okeechobee Watershed actually starts north of Walt Disney World. And from the beginning of time, Lake Okeechobee has become nothing but a catch basin reservoir for all the nutrients flowing from the north to the south. And this is a picture of from the South Florida Water Management District that shows the loads that's coming in north of the lake. And one thing that I like to try to clear up with a lot of people, the yellow spot right down here, I don't know if you can see my cursor move, but this is the Everglades agricultural area. And as you see on the news, this area has been blamed for a lot of the blue-green algae and coming out of the lake, but it's all south of the lake. Very little water comes out of the EAA that's pumped back into the lake. So the problem is north of the lake that's coming into the lake, that's coming into the flow. And the other thing people have got to remember also is Lake Okeechobee is a very shallow lake. It's only 10 feet deep in some of the deepest spots. So you've got decades of nutrients that have settled in the bottom of the lake. And then of course, this is a picture of the area that y'all are in of all the springs and where they're located. So what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is the 4R nutrient stewardship program that I work with farmers across the state on, and it's the right source of fertilizer with the right rate. And I kind of leave this up to the fertilizer reps and the agronomists and the consultants because that's their expertise. And also I want to be able to work with them. And so one of the things we want to do is make sure they're putting it out at the right time and in the right place. And the 4Rs are part of all the BMP manuals is being implemented as they're being updated. It started off in the vegetable manual. And as each of the manuals are updated and redone, the 4Rs are going to be placed in every one of them with the exact same wording to try to keep it on track where everybody understands it. And the 4Rs were developed by the Fertilizer Institute, the International Plant Nutrition Institute, and the Canadian Fertilizer Institute. And they have the scientific backing that if you follow the 4Rs, it's going to help improve and protect water quality. And that's what we all want to see. Uh-oh. There we go. One of the things that I did when I took this job was there's a national award called the 4R Advocate Award, and it's there's only 5 farmers across the state that's chosen every year. And one of my goals was to try to have a winner from Florida every year. And out of the 10 years, Florida's had 5 winners, which I'm very proud of. And it's all based on their nutrient management programs for their farms. The first 4R winner was Alan Jones. He's a 4,000 acre potato farmer in Manatee County. Alan is one that really thinks out of the box, and this is a banding fertilizer machine that he helped develop, and it drops the fertilizer right on the bed of his potatoes. He grows roughly 3,000 to 3,500 acres of potatoes. He also grows 900 acres of green beans every year on a rotation basis of where his potato land is. With this banding machine, he's also doing grid sampling. And just so y'all will understand the extent, he did a 10-year program and he soil sampled every acre for 5 years. So you take 4,000 acres of every acre being soil sampled. He's spending close to $40,000 a year just on soil samples. And then he's going to go to every 10 acres the second 5 years. And over a 10-year period, he really feels that he can have a very good grid of his farms with all the data that he's collecting. And not only is he fertilizing by soil samples, but he's also fertilizing by soil types. And he has reduced his fertilizer by over 35%. The other thing that Alan has done is he's gone to pivot irrigation. I know that that's something that is very common in the areas up there where y'all are, but in Southwest Florida, it's fairly new, except for dairies. But on his water, he's reduced his water by 60%. And one thing I like to show is this bottom picture here. Alan farms all around wetlands, and he has plenty of wildlife, and the wetlands are thriving because of his nutrient management practice. The second farmer that was a 4R Advocate Award winner is Gary Reeder in the Duet area. He farms 900 acres of tomatoes in the spring and 900 acres of tomatoes in the fall. He bans all of his fertilizer. What fertilizer you're seeing in this slide right here in these bands, and then it's covered with plastic. That is all the fertilizer he puts out for that crop season. He uses seep irrigation, but he's got it down to an art. He stays within his water limit. And when he wants his plants to grow, he raises the water table up. And when he wants them to slow down, he lowers the water table. He's also reduced his fertilizer by about 30%, and his irrigation is well under his allocated allotment to grow crops. And behind each tomato crop, he's planting a cover crop, and he's rotating. His farm's roughly 2,000 acres, and he farms 900 acres in one area for his fall crop, and then the other 900s in another area based on the soil types. Both of these farmers are not only doing soil types, but they're doing weekly tissue samples as their crops are growing. The third winner is 8,500 acre citrus grower. And one of their technologies is called the CNI. Whoops, I'm sorry. It's this mechanism here. And as y'all all know, greening has affected citrus, so there's a lot of resets. So what this seeing eye does is it actually reads the canopy of the tree, and then it tells the fertilizer spreader exactly how much fertilizer to put out per tree by the size of the tree. They've also put shields in the back of the fertilizer spreader to where it's throwing it all up under the tree, where years ago we used to fertilize from trunk to trunk. And we've seen a dramatic change in fertilizer because of this technology, and especially with greening and all the resets are going in the ground, where years ago citrus growers used to fertilize everything the same. And then also citrus growers used to do only two to three applications a year. Now they're doing anywhere from 7 to 16 applications a year, depending on their program. And they've learned that if they spoon feed them, they're seeing a lot better results and saving too. And it's a lot less fertilizer being able to be leached through the soil. The fourth winner was a strawberry grower. They grow about 300 acres of strawberries, and all their irrigation and fertilizer is done through drip tubing. I love to share this with my colleagues in the Midwest that our strawberry growers are doing an 80 split application of nitrogen. So basically what they're doing is they are spoon feeding them just a little bit every other day, or possibly every third day, depending on their program. And their water savings is just unbelievable, because what they do is they just do a couple of cycles, 30-minute cycles, several times a day. So they're not putting out large amounts of fertilizer. I mean, water, they're just putting out a little bit. So they're helping to maintain those, excuse me, those nutrients in the root zone and keep it there. because they're mainly all on a liquid fertilizer program. Our fifth winner is actually farms down in the Everglades agricultural area. They farm around 25,000 acres. If you eat sweet corn, there's a very good chance it comes off of Hunley Farms. They grow 9,000 acres of sweet corn, 8,000 acres of sugar cane, and then the rest of it is in leafy vegetables, and it varies because it depends on what the market is requiring. And there again, I said at the beginning that these guys are the vegetable basket for the whole eastern United States. They're side dressing their fertilizers. The muck soil is a whole different type of soil to deal with, but they also manage their water down there where they're keeping that water on the farm, and the ditches are kind of like a tailwater recovery system where they're constantly just putting it right back on the fields. But here again, they also are leaf tissue sampling weekly all of their crops, and that makes the decision on helping them decide what fertilizer they're going to put out next. Every time a 4R Advocate Award winner wins, TFI, the Fertilizer Institute, comes in and does a case study. And as you can see by following the 4R practices, strawberry growers saw a decrease of $105 an acre in their nutrient management programs. Seed potatoes saw a decrease to $29 an acre. Chip potatoes, it went up $6 because of just the timing and the sprays that are required on the chip potatoes. Cotton saw a decrease of $23 an acre, and tomatoes saw a decrease of $42 an acre in their nutrient management programs by following the 4Rs. One of the things that we've worked with farmers are soil moisture probes. The soil moisture probes help the farmer manage their irrigation. And the key to nutrient management is irrigation management, trying to hold those nutrients in the root zone. And by using the soil moisture probes, there's usually a 50+% savings in water, and then also a 35% savings in fertilizer use of trying to keep everything right here in this area where the roots can get the nutrients and the water. There's a lot of fertilizer companies and equipment companies that have become very creative in developing new equipment to help the farmer. And this equipment is being able to be cost shared. This is a banding machine that these can actually be changed because every crop is different, and you want to be able to get that fertilizer right there at the base of the plant. This is a machine that we started using down in Manatee County with one of the farmers that I had worked with. I kind of call it my disaster farm. It took me 2 years to get onto their farm. And then and just to give you an example of what it means by changing their practices, we went from banding their fertilizer, they were broadcasting it, and we went to banding their cabbage growers. And the very first year that we banded half of fields, they gave me 6 fields, and we split them in half, and we did half of them the 4R way and half of their conventional. The very first year by banding, we improved their cabbage by 2,200 pounds of acre. They only did 2 cuttings. On their conventional way, they did 4 cuttings, and they left 20% of the cabbage in the field because it never met the size. They were knifing their liquid applications in. We observed it. We found out they were cutting their roots. So we went to this machine, which is called a spike machine, and it injects the liquid fertilizer at a high pressure, and then it spreads out. And so that has made a world of difference in their production practices. I've been able to work with Joe Love and the team up in the Swanny area, and this is one of the farmers up there through cost share. He started off with this side dressing machine here that he was putting his liquid fertilizer down by the plants. And the first year he reduced his fertilizer by 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I'm a very big advocate of cost share because every farmer that I've seen that has started off with cost share money, it just makes their wheels start ticking. And the next year he went to a 360 Y drop and he ended up reducing his fertilizer by 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The other key is the soil moisture probes that we talked about too. And he had over a 200,000 or 200 million gallon reduction of water. And there again, irrigation management is nutrient management. We are working with farmers all over the state in coming in and planting cover crops. I've been able to learn a lot from Joel and his team to bring down to South Florida and getting our farmers to plant cover crops. And our fingers are crossed. We're getting ready to do a 3-year cover crop study with the Archambault Center so we can get more scientific data about the importance of cover crops in helping to improve and protect water quality and to help build the soil health back. This is a team effort of being able to get out, do field days to bring government agencies and anybody else out into the field and let them see firsthand what's being done. Education, education, education is all I can say. And we want to continue to show anybody and everybody what we're doing to help improve and protect the water quality. So what Florida's doing with the 4Rs, it is working. We can see the difference. We can see the impact that it's having. And believe me, every farmer wants to save water and nutrients because every time he turns on the pump, he sprays or he fertilizes, that's his profit going out of his pocket. And the other difference in Florida is most farmers in Florida are multi-generation farmers, and their plan is for their grandkids to continue on the family tradition. The other thing that we're working on real quick is the Florida 4R certification program. This is a program for fertilizer dealers, agronomists, and consultants. They will be audited 32 different points by a third-party auditor just so they can justify the recommendations that they are given to the farmers. And this is another step that Florida Agriculture has taken on their own. We made the announcement of this program back in November of 2019. We were all ready to kick it off. And then our good friend COVID hit, and we have been very, very careful. We don't want to send auditors into fertilizer offices because not only do we want to protect them, but it's so important that their reps protect the farmers. And just to give you an example, I have been very careful about the farmers that I go and visit, especially down here because they rely on so much hand labor. And a strawberry grower, if you get one of their pickers infected, then there could be a 40 to a 50 man crew that's quarantined for 2 weeks. And strawberries have got to be picked every day, and you just don't go pick up the labor. So we're hoping this year that we're going to be able to kick off this program. These are the supporters of the 4R certification program. And I will share with you that we've got 6 of the major fertilizer companies in Florida and 4 of the smaller fertilizer companies in Florida that are all ready to start this program as soon as they feel comfortable. My position with the Nature Conservancy is actually funded by the Mosaic and the Mosaic Foundation. And we continue to work with Florida Agriculture, all for the reasons to help improve and protect water quality. And I want to leave with you, this is one of the statements from one of my farmers that I thought was very, very good. That first of all is an understanding that if you live, conduct business, or visit the state of Florida, you are part of the problem. And once this is realized, the primary question that we all need to ask ourselves is what can I do to be part of the solution? We've all got to work together to help on the issues of improving and protecting water quality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And now we're going to pass it on to Joel Love, who's going to give the next presentation.
Can y'all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Emma. Okay, my name is Joel Love. I work with the University of Florida. Work on BMP outreach and education in the Swanny, Santa Fe, and Wauwatosa Springs basins. And I'm located here at Live Oak at the North Florida Research and Education Center here out northeast of Live Oak. Today I want to kind of give a brief history of where we come from in the Swanny Basin as far as nitrates, and try to end up as some of the things we're doing today, we think, as David has already emphasized, should impact water quality. There's a lot of research that is being done to determine if BMPs work. But folks, those things are expensive to do and they take time. And we can't wait because we have TMDLs and BMAPs in place with deadlines to meet. So we're putting our foot on the accelerator and trying to get these growers to adopt intuitively what makes common sense of what should protect water quality or improve water quality over time. So the Swanny River Partnership, some of y'all probably have heard of that, but basically a group of innovative, forward-looking leaders decided, if we're going to deal with this water quality issue, we've got to work together. Lawsuits don't accomplish anything. We've seen that across the country where people sue one another, and we've seen that in our own state. And those billions and millions of dollars that were spent in court could have been spent on solving the problem. And I think David is very, very well said that. So in the late 1990s, a group of people got together and formed the Swanny River Partnership. The partnership is made of stakeholders. In other words, people like you and me, people that use water in the basin, all of us, agencies, universities, conservation groups, industry, and municipalities. And I'm sure I'm leaving out somebody, but that's the major folks involved in this partnership. The lead entities up to this point have been Swanny River Water Management District, UF-IFAS, FDP, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, FDACS, Office of Ag Water Policy, and Farm Bureau. And all these, some of the people that used to work for them are retired now, but they got together and said, we need to do this. And so the partnership was formed, and it's hard to believe here we are in 2021, and we're dealing with some of the same issues, but I think we're making progress. And we do have a stakeholder steering committee that meets periodically through the year to guide and put their eyes on this effort. And you can see here, there's the website if you want to go look that up. Kelly All is our Swanny River Partnership Coordinator. She's located here at the Research Center with me. And she's working on updating the website and trying to get the word out of what we're working on and the things that are being accomplished by the Swanny River Partnership. So what is our job as a partnership? What are we trying to do? Well, number one is bring resources to the table to work on these issues. And as I emphasize, cooperatively work together. So we're doing research, we're doing education and outreach, we're doing technical assistance, and we're doing cost share. When I say that, I'm primarily thinking of farmers, but there's also some of this going on with even local government, with FDP and Water Management District provide a lot of money to help local governments deal with some of these issues we're dealing with. So who was the primary focus when we got started? Well, at the time I started working in this area, Lake Okeechobee was a big big issue at the time, and still is, even more so now than it was then. And the dairies were being focused on. And then the next thing we know up here, the dairies and poultry farms were being focused on up here. And we had the Clean Water Act in 1972. And then we had the EPA came along with CAFO and AFO, concentrated animal feeding operation regulations. And so we started working with dairy and poultry to deal with their animal waste. And we've had a lot of success there. The problem is we've lost a lot of our dairies due to the poor economic times, increasing costs, increasing regulations. And the dairies we've got left, a lot of them are forced to get very large. And some people struggle with that. But there are economies of scale, whether you agree with it or not. They were forced into managing animal waste the way they are now and cow comfort. And so you see a lot of confinement dairies now with large numbers of cows. Since 1999, there's been some other pieces of legislation that come along. The Springs legislation, I think, in 2016. And then as David just mentioned, this past year, maybe started in 2020, but passed this past year, Senate Bill 712 actually has more teeth related to septic tanks and waste treatment plants and a little blurb related to agriculture, but it's a big blurb. And that basically says, if you're an agriculture operation in the Swanny Basin or any BMAP in the state, and you're enrolled in BMPs, you will be inspected every 2 years, or that notice of intent will get a visit from FDAC's Ag Water Policy. And so the effort now is being primarily spent on row crop vegetable farms, hay and forage farms, nurseries, cow calf, sod, et cetera, in these basins. That's where the efforts are being spent. So what are examples of all this effort that's being put into this area? There's lots of cost share, and I don't even have the dollar figure because I haven't been able to keep up. There's been at least millions of dollars spent since the late 1990s in this basin related to just agriculture, not counting other entities. And so some of the cost share that's being spent up to this point has been through the federal government, USDA, Nrcs, Natural Resources Conservation Service, EQIP program, which stands for Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and Conservation Stewardship Program. And now they have an Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, which I think y'all are going to talk more about tonight. FDAC's Office of Ag Water Policy has money for cost share. They typically administer cost share through soil and water conservation districts in each county. And the main tool they're using now is BMP tools cost share in these BMAPs up here related to BMPs, focused primarily on nutrient management. In Swanny and Lafayette County, we got a special pot of money called the Gulf Restore Act Council funding. And just for these two counties at the moment, we hope that's expanded, and that's for irrigation retrofits and energy efficiency improvement. They're doing energy audits on like poultry farms, dairy farms, and row crop farms, primarily on irrigation system, and then improving the efficiency of fuel use or electricity. So that's a very good program and been very successful up to this point. Swanny River Water Management District has an irrigation efficiency improvement cost share program, primarily geared towards center pivot irrigation related to soil moisture probes, retrofitting the irrigation system to make them more efficient, and also putting on new technology that allows farmers to control irrigation from a smartphone, iPad, or a PC from their home. That's been a very successful program up to this point as well. Swanny River Water Management District and Florida Department of Environmental Protection is funding money to Swanny River for their precision ag program. And David has already mentioned variable rate application of nutrients. And so a farmer now can come in and apply for grid sampling, where somebody would come out and pull samples every 2.5 to 5 acres or by zone. And then basically the Water Management District would pay you to variable rate apply lime, P, or K on that farm, and you would get paid after you bring in an applied map that your vendor provided to you after you got through with that application. The other program is precision nutrient application. So if a farmer was interested in adopting one of the practices that David showed, where we're banning fertilizer by the row, there's cost share for that as well. So that's starting to build a little bit of steam and effort as well. As far as University of Florida IFAS, who I work for, we're doing a lot of research here in Quincy and Mariana related to these BMPs we're working on, trying to get some actual water quality data. And that takes time. We have a 16-year project here at the research center here in Live Oak, where we actually have devices underneath the ground, growing underneath the growing crop to capture any water that leaves the root zone during the growing season and monitor that for nitrate and see if these BMPs over time are working. So right now we're capturing baseline data, and then probably within a year and a half, we're going to start implementing BMPs and see what happens with water quality over time. And that's 4 different rotations under one pivot. And those rotations reflect the majority of the crops grown here that take a lot of nitrogen. That would be corn and carrots. And there's peanuts in there as well, but typically we don't put a whole lot of nitrogen on peanuts. So our role as far as University of Florida, about one of my roles in county extension agents and researchers. One of the things we're working very hard on is to take a new look at the IFAS recommendations that have been adopted by rule by the FDACs, and there's concern by the industry as a whole that maybe they're not correct. The rates are too low based on new genetics of the crops and new methods of farming. Now our yields are higher than when the research was done, so we got a little catch up to do there, and that's going to take some time. But we're working on that. We have some actual farmer committees formed to guide that effort. We have a lot more on-farm demonstrations where we actually take what we think should work on a farm based on some of the research maybe already done here, and actually take it to a grower and say, you give us half of your pivot and we'll bring these BMPs and put them side by side and see what you think, where they can see them in the context of their farming system. And we're having a lot of success there, but we're at least getting interest and buy-in from the growers to at least pay more attention to this. Of course, we've already mentioned the research we're doing. We're doing outreach and education through field days, of course, blogs, newsletters, our typical extension channels. We're providing technical assistance on farm. We go out and work with the growers with these on-farm demonstrations and actually demo plots on the farm. And then every county extension office has a stakeholder advisory committee where they have farmers that guide the extension offices. And we have one actually here for the research center as well. So let me shift gears a little bit right here. And I want to get into the meat and potatoes of this. And I'm going to focus on one of the BMP manuals. I don't have time tonight to go through all of them, but since row crop and vegetables are a big part of our area, and you saw David mention that 80% of the perceived load to these basins is coming from agriculture. It's not an urban issue. At least the majority of it's not an urban issue. So what are the BMPs that we really emphasize when we work with these farmers? David's already mentioned the 4R nutrient stewardship program. That's a big one. You will should find that in every manual eventually. It's not in there already. It just makes common sense to do that. The second thing right behind it is making sure your irrigation system's up to snuff. Because if you over irrigate or we get leaching rains, we cannot keep nutrients in the root zone. So that's a key to making all this work. And in many cases, we have irrigation systems applying fertilizer, which allows them to spoon feed, but it can be a double-edged sword if they're over irrigating. And so optimum irrigation water management is critical. And we can do that through apps or through scheduling, but the one that seems to be the easiest if the technology can be grasped is soil moisture probes, because the probes we have are monitoring 24/7 for the grower. And they have access to that data through their smartphones, iPads, or PCs. And it's interesting to see a farmer pull that phone out when you show up to his farm and show you their soil moisture probe. It kind of warms your heart to see some of the older ones doing it. Even you think the young ones would, but now we have older farmers that are starting to grasp it now. Conservation tillage. Again, our main issue here is wind erosion, but over where I live in Jefferson County, we have slope and more runoff. So we have water erosion. Anytime anything's leaving the field in the soil, nutrients, pesticides or whatever, we need to keep that on the hill and not run off. So limiting the amount of tillage we're doing on the land is important. And right along a hip attached at the hip with that practice is cover crops. And I'm a big proponent of multi-species blend cover crops and legumes, because if we can grow legumes in the context of our cropping systems, we can be less reliant on purchased nitrogen, and it should be more slowly available to the next cash crop if managed correctly. And then I think another big one that's going to be more important in the future, it's going to be harder to get done, but go back and farm like we used to years ago before we got cheap fertilizer and cheap inputs, and integrate livestock back into these cropping systems and rotate perennial grasses and livestock with row crop and vegetables, and then long-term build soil health back to where it needs to be to help us conserve water and hold these nutrients on the land instead of leaching out of these very sandy soils. And of course, we've already mentioned the 4R side dressing of nutrients or wide space crops like corn, carrots, potatoes, anything planted in a wide row instead of broadcasting the fertilizer. So here's some examples of what our farmers are using. David's already mentioned banding of nitrogen or banding of phosphorus. In this case, we're banding nitrogen on row crop, and we have various methods of doing that. In the top left-hand corner, see if I can put my cursor up here, is a high boil where we've got a project called the 4R demonstration project for 5 years, again funded by Swanny River Water Management District and FDAC, to actually use this high boil to go out and side dress nitrogen on corn farms for the next 5 years. And basically show up with a machine and they provide us with nitrogen, and we side dress their crop for that season from start to finish as an alternative to broadcasting all of the nitrogen fertilizer, which most are doing now. So we're just doing this as a demonstration project. And then at the end of the year, we're going to go back and look at the yields, and the farmer gets to see this again in his own farm and see what he thinks about this. So in the right-hand column is basically the same thing, is a wide drop method being used for the nitrogen dribbled right at the base of the corn plant. This is just a ground application unit. The downside of this is once the corn gets too tall, we can't use this anymore. This is where the high boil comes in. But we have one large farm that he's going over his 5,000 acres of corn twice with 2 of these units to side dress nitrogen, and then he's put the rest of the nitrogen through the irrigation system to finish the crop. Here's an example of a dry banding unit we're using here at the research center. And so some people want to use liquid, some people want to use dry, some might want to use a combination of both. So there are dry banders. David's already showed you some examples. And we're actually using this to band control release fertilizer because it's granular with coating, and we can't use the control release. We don't have that in the liquid form. So we're about to have this kind of unit. So this is important. This is just one example. And then here's a guy that's side dressing, trying to put nitrogen. You see the nitrogen bands right by tobacco. This guy's out of Georgia this year, and I applaud him for doing that down here. And then cover crops, that is starting to get more interest. If you drive around, especially in Gilchrist and Levy County, you're going to see acres and acres of sun hemp that's being planted behind corn silage. There's several different reasons. One is to control weeds after harvest, because they start harvesting corn silage in July, and that land sits fallow unless it's double crop all the way to frost before they plant a winter cover crop. And that's not good for soil health. It's not good for resistant weeds that grow up and make seed to be in your next year's cash crop. And it's not good for soil microbes. They need cooler soil to live in. That soil gets hot through summer and is more susceptible to erosion as well. So here's one of our demo cover crop farms in Madison County. He's actually planting cover crop on 5,000 acres behind corn. So one of the things we're after is if there's any leftover nitrogen after this corn crop, we grow a cover crop, plant it immediately after harvest, and sequester that nitrogen. So here you see the cover crop a couple weeks later. This is sun hemp and sorghum Sudan that he came up with this blend himself after we gave him some suggestion. I applaud him for that. And if you notice, this cover crop doesn't look very green. And so this is almost a quick way to say, you know what, I did a pretty good job of nitrogen management. There's not a leftover nitrogen out there. But if there was, that helps capture it for the next cover crop or for the next cash crop. So here's another method. This is one of our farmers in Alachua County. William McGee, he's drilling a winter cover crop blend to graze. And this is him. In fact, this is Christmas Day. He's standing in it to get ready to turn the cattle in on it. He's one of our cover crop demo farms. And here's a multi-species blend that now we got him started using this the first year, and he seems to really like these now for grazing his beef cattle on. And then here's just a couple more examples of how farmers are planting cover crops. They're getting very innovative on how they're doing this because some of them really see the value of this, getting it done early. In the top left-hand column, this is our county agent in Jefferson County, Danielle Sprague, standing in a crop or a cover crop of hairy vetch and winter peas and some other things as well that are being overshadowed because this hairy vetch is very explosive growth here in about, I think, around April, May. And this was flown on with an airplane in the standing soybeans before the crop was harvested to get that cover crop established early and get some early growth out of it. So there's all kind of ways to plant cover crop, and a farmer might use 3 methods on the same farm in the same year to plant cover crops. Here's another one of our cover crop demo farms. It's actually interseeding a cover crop in his peanuts before he digs them. So you will see here they're spreading seed and fertilizer. Here he's digging his dash, digging the peanuts. And so the peanut digger is actually planting the cover crop seed. It's covering it as he digs. And this is a couple weeks later. Actually got cover crop growing in the peanut vines before they can pick. We got caught by a rain delay, but we still got the peanuts picked and the cover crop was fine. And then other thing, again, I just mentioned a while ago is livestock row crop integration, where we actually have farms that are trying to rotate Bahia grass with cattle for a couple of years. That de-intensifies the land use. Those 2 years it's a Bahia because it's not getting fertilized as hard or irrigated as hard. And then they convert that Bahia grass to a row crop. Could be watermelons, could be peanuts, could be peanuts followed by corn, could be carrots. It doesn't really matter. The old rotations and the old farms used to say always their best crops were always behind Bahia grass and cattle, and we got away from that, but we need to get back to that. And so these are examples of guys strip tilling in a winter grazing crop. This is on Mr. McGee's farm, and he's already been through the Bahia grass rotation in a 5-year demo project with us. Here's a cover crop being grazed, and we got an exclusion cage with a soil moisture probe in it to protect it from the cattle. And this is our county agent, again, standing in that same cotton field where those peanuts, where the cover crop was interseeded in that peanut crop, and see how good the cotton looks there. So let me give one example, and David's already hit on this. So we're going to repeat each other a little bit, but I'm going to use these 2 examples because this is important. The big question by all of us and by some of the environmental groups, will do these BMPs work? Well, we're still working on that. We got to get the data that shows some of that. But intuition should tell us if we're cutting back on the amount of nitrogen we're putting on a crop, something should happen eventually in a spring somewhere in the positive, unless something else is offsetting that savings we just did on the farm. And that's the other thing we got to keep in our back of mind. So here's 2 examples. Here's a cover crop example on our Madison County cover crop farm, and he's also our 4-hour demo farm. He had 5,000 acres of cover crop planting post-harvest corn this year. Never done that before. Did 1,200 last year. So we're projecting the nitrogen recovered or recycled of around 30 pounds per acre. When you do the math on that many acres, if I did the math correct, that's 150,000 pounds of nitrogen sequestered. It's not going to groundwater by just growing that cover crop. So if you take that number and then project that on the 30,000 plus or minus corn acres in the basin, and that's a rough number, we can almost save 1 million pounds of nitrogen or sequester that much nitrogen if we planted a cover crop behind all these corn acres, unless we're double cropping something else. So that's just something to think about. And that's where we're working on. That's where all this cost share and technical assistance and outreach and education helps us. And then the 4R demo that David has already mentioned on 5,000 acres of corn using 4Rs and soil moisture probes. We project a 50-pound in reduction there from where he started. We've been working with him about 6+ years. Projected 250,000 pounds of N saved on those 5,000 acres by doing the side dressing and using the soil moisture probe. He also mentioned the water savings he's gotten from doing that. I think David put that figure on there. So if we take that number and project that across the corn acres in the basin, that's 1.5 million pounds of N potentially we could save by using these practices up here. Well, if you remember the number David just gave us a while ago, it's 4 million pounds. That gives me hope we can put a dent in this thing if we can get those kind of numbers by just doing back of the dog food sack math. So to me, I think we can do this, but we've all got to work together, and we can't allow some other load come in here and undo everything we've already done. And that's my presentation. I hope I caught us back up.
Thank you so much, Joel. Now we're going to pass it on to Justice and Erica.
Okay, can you see my screen? Good. Okay, thanks, Emma. And thank you to Joel and David again, and all the work you do here in Florida. That was really informative. Okay, so I'll start today's presentation by giving a little background into Alachua Conservation Trust, or ACT, as an organization. So our mission here at ACT is to protect the natural, historic, scenic, and recreational resources in and around North Central Florida. And Alachua Conservation Trust protects land through purchase, donations, and conservation easements, which we're going to be talking about today. We do this throughout 16 counties in North Central Florida. Here is a map of those 16 counties. And while this is our primary working area, we do have projects all over the state of Florida. Okay, a little more background. Alachua Conservation Trust is a nonprofit, and since 1988, we have conserved over 54,000 acres of land. Currently, we have a professional staff of 14, and we are growing every day. Okay, moving on to private land conservation. So why is private land conservation important? Well, that really depends on the individual landowner's goals and vision for their property. So maybe a landowner has a farm and they want to keep it in their family for generations to come, and they don't want to see their land subdivided or paved over. Maybe another landowner wants to help protect important waterways like the Swanny or the Santa Fe from further development. Or maybe a landowner wants to bring back their land to its natural state and help bring back wildlife like quail for hunting. And so one way a landowner can achieve some of those goals I just mentioned is through a conservation easement. So a conservation easement is basically an agreement between a landowner and an easement holder, such as Alachua Conservation Trust, to protect land from being developed or subdivided in perpetuity. So as a landowner, you have certain rights. You can lease your land, sell your land, subdivide it, or develop it. With a conservation trust, with a conservation easement, you are typically giving up the right to subdivide or intensify the land in perpetuity. So that means whoever inherits your land or purchases the land in the future will have to adhere to the terms of the conservation easement, and they likely will not be able to subdivide the land or intensify it. And so, as I mentioned, every landowner has a unique vision for their land. So one advantage to conservation easements is that they are customizable on the front end. And so I say on the front end because these agreements cannot be altered in the future. So it's important to have clear intentions for your property before we begin the process. And in case some of y'all are wondering, a conservation easement does not mean public access for your land. Your land remains private. Okay, now I'll cover agricultural land conservation easements, or ALEs. So an agricultural land easement is just a type of conservation easement designed to permanently protect agricultural land and limit non-farm development. So an agricultural land easement is a good fit for a landowner whose property is primarily farmland, and they would like to keep that land available for farming in the future. So some advantages to agricultural land easements is that it can help transfer the land to future generations of farmers, and it can actually give the farmers some capital to reinvest back into their farm. And just to reiterate, these are flexible documents when they're designed. So, it's important to consider where you may want to put structures like barns or future housing before we draft the terms of the easement. And again, a conservation easement does not mean public access on your land. So now I will talk a little bit about the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. So this program is delegated through the 2018 US Farm Bill, and this program provides financial assistance to purchase agricultural land easements to help conserve farmland, ranchland, grassland, and wetlands. So this is a competitive grant-funded opportunity. Alachua Conservation Trust will work closely with the landowner to determine if an agricultural land easement is a good fit. And if so, we can apply to this program on your behalf. And so if accepted, this program provides up to 50% of the fair market value of the conservation easement, and that goes directly to the landowner. So an ALE is a good opportunity for farmers who want to keep their land available for farming. And another point I wanted to make about this program is that it involves the creation of a management plan, and that plan will outline activities and practices that will help ensure the long-term viability of the land and its conservation value. Okay, now I'll touch on a little bit of eligibility requirements for the agricultural land easement program. So your land must be at least 50% cropland, rangeland, pastureland, or in production of food, forage, or fiber. And I won't go too much into the weeds here, but as an owner, you must meet the adjusted gross income provisions, establish eligibility through your local county farm service agency, and have some access to agricultural markets. So Alachua Conservation Trust will work closely with you to help determine your eligibility for this program before we apply. And now I'll discuss the EQIP program, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So this is another cost share opportunity delegated through the 2018 US Farm Bill. And this program provides financial and technical aid to improve farming practices, wildlife habitat, and water quantity and quality. And so just like the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, EQIP is a competitive program, and applications are ranked based on conservation and cost benefits. And there are over 200 different EQIP practices that you can apply for funding for. And a lot of these just overlap what Joel and David touched on. This is stuff like cover cropping, nutrient management plans, silvopasture, irrigation scheduling, a lot of overlap with best management practices. And so ACT and the Natural Resources Conservation Service will work with a landowner to determine whether EQIP is a viable program for them. And if so, we can help you apply. And if you're accepted, EQIP shares 75% of the cost of implementing the practices. And they apply, they provide the funding to the farmer in the form of a reimbursement. And I think EQIP often pairs nicely with the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, because a lot of these practices help ensure the long-term viability and conservation of the land. And lastly, I'll note that similarly to the Agricultural Land Easement Program, EQIP does involve the creation of a management plan that outlines the practices and how and when they'll be implemented. So now I will pass it on to Erica Hernandez, who will discuss some of the easement terms as well as conservation easement value.
Thank you, Justice. And so, we're here today talking about all of these best management practices and efficiencies and ways to protect soil and water. And these tools, conservation easements, and these management cost shares that are available through the different agencies, organizations such as ourselves or IFAS can help connect you to some of these tools. And conservation easements are kind of our main bread and butter when working with private citizens and helping them protect their land. And so we work with all different types of conservation easements. And as Justice said, agricultural land easements are specifically designed to protect rural agricultural lands. And you can have multi-use. You can have silviculture and cow-calf operations. You can grow vegetables. But the idea is to preserve agricultural land, but also engage in these best management practices to protect soil and water, potentially wildlife. And depending on your land use, depending on where you are geographically, if you're in specific watersheds or close to springs, there are different resources available to you that can aid in the protection of your land and management of your land. And so we would essentially work with you to determine if there is a program out there that's a good fit and just try and understand what it is that you'd like to do. But on the day-to-day, a landowner maintains their property exactly how they always have. And essentially, it's just in the future, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we want to make sure that your intention for keeping the property together, maybe keeping it in the family, or maybe one day, if someone else buys it, it is still being managed and held in the way that you had envisioned when it was initially protected. Next slide. Thank you. So there are potential financial benefits. There are different ways of protecting land with conservation easement. Some folks are in a position where they can donate the value of the conservation easement. And with that donation, it is considered a charitable donation. And if it meets the IRS definition for a conservation easement and has true conservation value, then there could be income tax deductions. And so, especially with agricultural land, if over 90% of your income is deducted from agricultural production, you can essentially claim the value of the conservation easement for up to 15 years after you record the easement. And so we'll talk a little bit further about conservation easement value and how that's determined, as well as you are essentially limiting the development pressure on your property. If your property is, 200 acres, and with the conservation easement, we are extinguishing the right to be able to subdivide it into 20-acre parcels or 5-acre parcels, that is in sense diminishing the value. And so that can benefit your heirs and can benefit the estate tax. And then in some cases, as we were discussing tonight, there are programs that will that are competitive and that are grants, but can actually have a cash payment where we can buy the value of the conservation easement. And so one of the best tools right now available for farmland, for productive land, is the Nrcs Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, the ALE program. And it is competitive, and we want to make sure that we have a strong application. And we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so conservation easement value, of course, is a great concern to the landowner. And so if we're talking about the donated value of a conservation easement or the bargain sale, a bargain sale is when you sell a conservation easement below appraised value. So maybe you get some cash for it, but then maybe you're also able to deduct some of it from your taxes. And so that requires an appraisal, and it has to be an appraisal by someone who is qualified under our state rules for a conservation easement assessment, as well as the IRS rules. So there is an issue nationally with something called syndicated easements, where folks can sometimes have used easements as tax shelters. And that's not what this is. We really work hard to make sure that there is conservation value and that we stay up to date with all of the IRS requirements so that we have a strong document that really does do as it's intended and protect land as it's intended. And then, it is limited funding. And so we look for projects that we know and work with our partners to figure out what it is that they're looking for to fund so that we can be competitive. Next slide. And so if we're trying to determine what the conservation easement value is, the way that that is done through appraisal is an appraiser will look at the fair market value of the property as it is today. If you were to put it on the market right now, what would it actually sell for? And they determine that by doing comparable sales evaluations, properties that are like yours in size, in content, in land use, in area, and they figure out, kind of this range of potential value. And then they look at the conservation easement. And now the conservation easement is something that organizations like Electoral Conservation Trust have negotiated with the landowner. We have templates where we kind of have these basic outlines of what is typically allowed and what is typically restricted. And we negotiate with the landowner to make sure that this is a design that works for you and your intention for how you want your property to be managed. And when we finalize that document, it will list basically how your property is restricted. So if you have a very strict conservation easement that's really limiting a lot of development, a lot of change, and maintaining a lot of conservation value, the conservation easement potentially has greater value than if it has a lot of allowances for change and development. And the value of the conservation easement is also going to be very related to development pressure. If you're in a very rural area without a lot of development pressure, and the way that you utilize your property right now for silviculture, for hunting, for passive recreation with family, and your conservation easement is basically maintaining the same thing, there's not a big diminishment of value of how you utilize your property. And so these types of things factor into that determination of conservation value. Next slide. And so if we're thinking about designing a conservation easement, a lot of folks, they might have mixed use. They might have some cattle, some timber, some hay fields. These are what we would consider a pretty low intensity agricultural use. And so there might be areas, one is really interested in maintaining the family property and maybe one moved away. So a conservation easement can really be a useful tool if you're concerned that, once you move on, the children may have a difficult time deciding, is it time to sell the land? Is it time to hold on to it? Are we able to buy one of the siblings out? Or would there be a grandchild one day that would like to build a house out there? So these tools can help you kind of determine what's going to happen to the property. If it's sold, can it all stay together? If it's maintained, can we keep a building envelope so that your grandchild or two could build a home out there? And we'll identify that area so that we determine the least amount of impact and preserve the property as a whole. Next slide. And so when we talk about the process, initially, just get in touch with us and we'll talk to you about the property and look for opportunities to see if there are programs out there that would be a good fit for protecting your property. We basically just want to really understand what your intentions are. Usually we'll do a site visit, and if we think that you're a good fit for the Nrcs program, we can help you start getting the paperwork rolling with this Farm Service Agency documentation to qualify for the initial application. And ACT takes care of the application. We work with you to get signatures and essentially try and buffer you from the massive amounts of paperwork and documentation that is required for these federal programs. And if we determine that we're going to work together and we can kind of get on the same page about what a conservation easement would look like and how you want to utilize your property, and if there's an opportunity to maybe decrease intensity and protect soil and water or wildlife habitat, we'll negotiate an option contract so that we kind of solidify our commitment to each other that we're going to go after these grants and we're going to help find a way to protect your property. And in the meantime, we'll be reaching out to our partners and looking for opportunities for cost share to do management, things like EQIP, things like land assistance programs with the Fish and Wildlife Service. There are a lot of opportunities out there. And when you start enrolling in a conservation easement, that kind of commitment to land protection makes it easier to bring in other cost share and other sources, because these agencies will realize that it's a good investment of their funding because this land is going to be protected to a certain standard that they can get behind. And once we finalize the conservation easement and we go through that negotiation, we are doing due diligence, we're doing title work, we are doing boundary surveys and environmental site assessments, especially if we're going to be receiving any kind of grant funding from the state, from Nrcs, then we have to meet their standards for the due diligence, for the boundary surveys and that sort of thing. So we work with you to make sure that we can do that. And then once a conservation easement is recorded, that is a restriction on the deed. We record that with the county. We will do annual monitoring. We have a relationship with our landowners that have conservation easements. So we work with you. We don't show up and do surprise surveys on your land. We call you and we ask if we can come and see you, and we talk about how things are going, and we compare the property to the baseline documentation when we first recorded the conservation easement. And that becomes very important down the line, 25 years from now or the future, when we're trying to determine if the property is really being maintained and managed as to the intentions that we had when we first protected the property. And then in that meantime as well, if you realize that you need assistance, some folks realize that they can't burn their property like they used to or treat the exotics like they used to. Sometimes we can help with resources to help connect you with tools to manage your land. Next slide. And so just to kind of round it all out, these agricultural easements, these conservation easements, they're the same thing. It's just essentially making sure that in the design of these documents that we're really addressing the type of land that's being protected. And they're very personalized to the landowner and to the land itself. And we are looking for public benefit, not in terms of public access, but in terms of benefiting wildlife as a whole, benefiting open space, keeping urban sprawl and development and intensification of these rural landscapes from happening, protecting the environment, protecting soil and water. And then potentially there are some personal benefits. It is a really useful tool for family planning, for holding on to that legacy of land. And then there's potentially the tax deduction tools as well. And sometimes you can even get funding, for example, through the agricultural land easement program, where that funding can then help you with management or investment, or however it is that it needs to be utilized by your family. And so if this is of interest to you, this is a really kind of quick overview of some of the tools that are out there, but we'd love to talk to you about the program and assist you with figuring out if this is a good fit for you and how we can aid you in protecting your property. So thank you so much. We might have a little bit of time for questions for all of our panelists. And I
Yeah,
think
it looks like we've got about 7 minutes or so for questions, and we've got a couple in the chat, so we'll get to them. Sorry, my screen is taking a while to adjust. This question was kind of answered by Joel in the chat, but I'm going to ask it again, just in case somebody didn't see it. But does the EQIP provide funding for habitat restoration, pine plantings, for example? Joel, if you want to just kind of chime in and repeat what you said in the chat, that would be great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I know they do for like longleaf pine habitat restoration. That's one of their high priorities in the southeastern United States. There may be some other things as well, but for sure that. But I would just go to your local NRCS field office, last conservation district office, and talk to them, because those programs change over time and where the priorities for the funding are spent.
Thank you so much. And if anybody else would like to chime in.
I can speak to that a little bit as well. So NRCS is really focusing on source water protection areas, and there are EQIP resources that are basically looking for improving wildlife habitat and recharge in sandhill ecosystems. And there is funding out there where it does benefit the agricultural side, but you can rank higher if there is also wildlife habitat and opportunity for things like longleaf planting and restoring any kind of rangeland potential. So there are a lot of different tools out there for natural landscapes where you can kind of work with your district conservationists and through organizations like ACT to come up with a combination of these conservation practices through NRCS, where you could do things like both brush reduction if you're having oaks coming in to your property, and also planting longleaf pine. There's definitely a lot of funding right now available for that, and also things like gopher tortoise habitat and different things associated with those natural communities. So yeah, there are those opportunities.
Thank you so much, Erica and Joel. There's a question in the Q&A box that is, what is the duration of ag land CEs?
What is the duration of what?
Of the ag land CEs.
So conservation easements by design are meant to be permanent. And so as we design the conservation easement, we want to create a design that is flexible in the sense that we can expect that the science is going to change. Things like best management practices for certain agricultural practices might change. And so instead of maybe nailing down a very specific thing, we're going to speak more to the available science and the best management practices available, and always look towards ways to protect soil and water. And so landowners are able to make these very, very strict if they would like to, but we don't necessarily recommend that, because you want to be able to have something that won't be challenged in the future. But they are meant to be permanent. They aren't meant to be broken. And really, especially through NRCS, there really isn't any mechanism for, if you violate the conservation easement, there's no mechanism really for changing the conservation easement. You essentially have to undo the violation. So they're pretty permanent, and they can also be tools for helping things like eminent domain or pipelines and things like that, as a tool that wouldn't necessarily prohibit that activity if it was going to occur, but it could be a resource to help deter things. And we've had properties that were going to have the stable pipeline going through them, and the pipeline was actually moved to the property edge and around the property because there was a conservation easement.
Thank you so much, Erica. It looks like we have time for about one more question, which is, what is the typical timeline for closing on a conservation easement?
So it really depends, and it depends on if the property is a donated conservation easement. That really quickens the timeline quite a bit. If we are engaging with agencies for funding, then there can be timelines are really kind of a little bit more based on grant cycles and the review that's required by these agencies. It can take months, it can take years. It just depends on the complexity of projects. And so if it's a really straightforward, easy project, it could take 1 to 2 years. It takes time for us to research to make sure that our conservation easements make sense with local law, state law, the conservation resource that we're protecting. So a lot of effort goes into it. And as a nonprofit, we have a lot of projects going on and a lot of grants that we're working on. And so it does take some time to get through to one, but that is a conversation that we can kind of have and evaluate through conversation of determining what it is that you'd like to do.
Thank you, Erica. And one more just came through the chat, so we'll grab that one real quick as well, which is that you've talked a lot about the benefits to landowners, but what are some of the typical costs of establishing an easement?
Sure. So it again kind of depends on if we have a grant opportunity, if we have a competitive project that has funding. And so for certain types of projects, the grant funding would help pay for things like due diligence, related to boundary surveys and environmental site assessments and things like that. Sometimes we don't have a grant for that type of thing. And so with an agricultural land easement, that only pays for 50% of the value of the conservation easement. It does not pay for the due diligence. So sometimes the Alachua Conservation Trust can try and find another grant opportunity that can also match the conservation value from Nrcs. Sometimes we don't. And so sometimes the landowner could then basically donate that, and that could be their portion that they claim on their taxes if they're receiving funding for the value. And sometimes we have these grants. We do have endowments to protect the property. And so that essentially allows us to purchase title insurance. It helps us set up our baseline documentation. And it also gives us the tools to protect this property forever. It's on Alachua Conservation Trust to make sure that the terms of the easement are protected forever. And so there is this baseline endowment to protect your property specifically that allows us to do that. So those are conversations that we have as we start to determine what funding is available and what type of project this is going to be.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us tonight and speaking to us about all of these programs. If you have any more questions, Justice and Erica's emails are on the screen, and I believe David and Joel dropped theirs in the chat, so you can grab it from there. And that's going to conclude our program from tonight. Everybody have a wonderful evening.